For years, the European Union operated on a single, fragile assumption: the belief that when Brussels spoke, the member states would listen. That era is dead. What we are witnessing across the continent is not a standard diplomatic disagreement. It is not a routine policy debate. It is a fundamental fracture in the very architecture of European power. The unified front that Commission President Ursula von der Leyen has tirelessly projected to the world regarding Ukraine has effectively collapsed. And the most terrifying part for the establishment? This unity was not dismantled by foreign enemies. It was dismantled from within. The narrative of total solidarity was carefully curated by the European Commission. It was a shield designed to hide a deepening resentment. But that shield has now been shattered. For months, the central leadership in Brussels operated with a dangerous confidence. They believed that the sheer geopolitical urgency of the conflict in Ukraine would override national interests indefinitely. They believed that the crisis was enough to enforce obedience. They miscalculated. The silence from Central European capitals was never a sign of agreement. It was the quiet accumulation of leverage. It was the sound of nations waiting for the right moment to strike back. Now, that leverage is being deployed in a way that threatens to paralyze the Commission's entire agenda. This crisis goes far deeper than the headlines suggest. Official statements might use the polite, safe language of trade adjustments or market protections. Do not be fooled. The reality on the ground is a full-scale authority crisis. The central spine of the EU, Poland, Hungary, and Slovakia, has drawn a definitive red line. They have signaled that the era of blind compliance with Brussels' strategic vision is finished. This is the moment the establishment feared most. It is the realization that the Union's geopolitical goals are now in direct conflict with the survival instincts of its own member states. The facade of a frictionless, unified Europe has been stripped away. What lies beneath is a chaotic struggle for control, where the established hierarchy no longer holds sway. The illusion is gone. The fight for reality has begun. How does a supranational superpower lose control? It does not happen on a battlefield. It happens when the tools of enforcement simply stop working. The defiance we are witnessing from Central Europe represents something far more dangerous than political noise. It is a specific, calculated rejection of the Commission's legal supremacy. This was not a chaotic riot in the streets. It was a cold, precise, bureaucratic mutiny. By implementing unilateral bans and refusing to adhere to collective mandates regarding Ukrainian exports, these nations did not just break a rule, they essentially nullified the core principle of the EU's single market. They did not ask for permission, they simply acted. This move was a direct strike at the heart of the Commission's legitimacy. In the glass corridors of Brussels, power is designed to flow downwards. The technocrats dictate, and the nations obey. That is the system. But that dynamic has been violently reversed. The leadership in Warsaw, Budapest, and Bratislava understood that the time for polite negotiation had run out. They realized that waiting for a consensus-based solution from Brussels was no longer an option. They looked at the machinery of the European Union and saw a system that was too slow to survive. The bureaucratic engine in Brussels moves at a glacial pace, often refusing to acknowledge immediate national crises until it is too late. The Central European capitals refuse to wait for the disaster to hit. By taking independent action, they stripped the Commission of its most potent weapon, the ability to dictate the timeline. The significance of this tactical shift cannot be overstated. It exposes a critical, fatal vulnerability in the very structure of the European Union. The entire system relies on one thing: the voluntary submission of states to a central authority. It is a house of cards built on consent. When that voluntary submission is withdrawn, Brussels is left with very few options. The policy rebellion has proven that national governments still possess the ultimate kill switch for EU initiatives. They have demonstrated that they can effectively veto Brussels' foreign policy strategy, not by arguing in a parliament, but by refusing to implement the domestic economic consequences that come with it. The chain of command has been broken. It was not severed by grand speeches or diplomatic letters. It was severed by the cold, hard reality of executive orders signed in national capitals, bypassing Ursula von der Leyen entirely. To understand the sheer ferocity of this pushback, you must look past the high-minded rhetoric of international solidarity. You must ignore the polished press releases and examine the brutal economic reality on the ground. The disconnect between the strategic goals of the European Commission and the lived experience of Central European citizens has become an unbridgeable chasm. For the leadership in Brussels, the strategy regarding Ukraine is a geopolitical necessity. It is a moral imperative that requires sacrifice. But for the nations bordering the conflict, that word, sacrifice, ceased to be an abstract concept long ago. It became an existential economic threat. The Commission's strategy created a scenario where local markets were not just strained, they were destabilized to support a broader foreign policy objective. This was viewed by the affected nations not as aid, but as economic cannibalism. The mechanism of this disaster was simple and devastating. The influx of agricultural products and the shifting logistical burdens were supposed to flow through the continent. They were supposed to reach global markets. That was the promise. But in reality, they were not absorbed by the wealthy nations of Western Europe. They did not flood the markets of Paris or Berlin. They hit the frontline states with devastating force. Poland, Hungary, Slovakia. These nations became the holding pens for a glut of supply that drove local prices into the ground. When local industries began to buckle under the pressure of unregulated competition sanctioned by their own union, the social contract shattered. Citizens watched in horror as their livelihoods were traded away by distant bureaucrats who would never have to pay the price of their own decisions. A farmer in Central Europe is bound by strict, expensive EU regulations. They play by the rules. Then, overnight, they were forced to compete with a tsunami of goods that followed none of those rules. It was a rigged game, and Brussels was the dealer.
This is where the narrative of unity finally died. It is impossible to maintain political discipline when the electorate feels actively betrayed by the system meant to protect them. You cannot ask a population to bankrupt itself for a geopolitical strategy they did not vote for. The governments of these nations were left with a binary, impossible choice. They could continue to serve the geopolitical ambitions of Brussels and face domestic political annihilation, or they could defy the European Union to protect their own economies. They chose survival. They looked at the rising anger in their rural heartlands and realized that the breaking point had been reached. They exposed the uncomfortable, explosive truth that the EU's Ukraine strategy was being subsidized by the bankruptcy of Central European farmers and businesses. This was no longer a debate about foreign policy. It was a desperate defense against economic collapse. The leaders of these nations understood something that Ursula von der Leyen failed to grasp. A state's primary duty is to its own people. When that duty conflicts with a directive from Brussels, the directive will burn. These governments did not act out of malice. They acted out of necessity. They refused to let their domestic stability be the collateral damage of a distant war. This was the moment the economic disconnect turned into a political weapon. By prioritizing their own economic survival, these nations stripped away the moral superiority of the Commission. They revealed that the cost of solidarity was being paid almost exclusively by the East, while the West watched from a safe distance. The illusion of shared burden was exposed as a lie, and once that truth was out, there was no going back. The governments of Central Europe decided that if saving their economy meant burning bridges with the Union's leadership, then they would light the match. The economy is not just numbers on a screen. It is the lifeblood of political legitimacy, and Brussels had tried to drain it dry. Brussels is now trapped in a nightmare of its own making. The European Commission faces a paradox that exposes the absolute limits of its power. It is a trap with no exit, a dilemma with no solution. Legally, Brussels cannot allow this defiance to stand. The treaties are clear. The rules are absolute. But politically, they cannot afford to stop it. Consider the reality of the map. If Ursula von der Leyen moves to punish these nations with harsh sanctions or infringement procedures, she risks triggering a strategic catastrophe. She risks alienating the very members who are critical to the logistical and military support of Ukraine. Poland, Slovakia, Hungary. These are not just member states. They are the transit hubs. They are the physical gateway for every weapon, every tank, and every creative aid heading to the front lines.
To declare political war on these nations is to declare war on the logistics of the Ukrainian defense. It would be strategic suicide, and the leaders in Warsaw and Budapest know it.
However, the alternative is equally dangerous. Doing nothing is not a safe option. It is a surrender. If the Commission allows this unilateralism to go unchecked, it sets a fatal precedent that could unravel the entire legal order of the bloc. It signals to every other member state, from the frugal North to the debt-ridden South, that EU laws are merely suggestions. It tells them that mandates from Brussels are valid only until they become inconvenient. The authority of the Union rests on one thing: the certainty of its rules. If that certainty vanishes, the Union ceases to be a governing body and becomes a debating club. By forcing Brussels into this corner, the dissenting nations have paralyzed the central leadership. They have called the bluff. They have looked at the threats of consequences and realized they are empty. They know that the cost of enforcement is simply too high for Ursula von der Leyen to pay. This standoff has done more than just delay policy. It has reorganized the power dynamics of the entire continent. The center of gravity is shifting right before our eyes. For decades, the European project was driven by the Franco-German engine. Paris and Berlin dictated the tempo. They set the agenda. They brought the eastern flank to heel. But that engine is sputtering. It is failing. The traditional powers are unable to force compliance, and their silence is deafening. In their place, a new reality has emerged. The Central European Coalition has effectively seized veto power over the practical implementation of the Ukraine strategy. They have proven a point that Brussels tried desperately to ignore. Without their cooperation, the grand plans of the Commission are physically impossible to execute. You can pass all the resolutions you want in a parliament in Brussels, but if the border guards in Poland or the customs agents in Slovakia do not cooperate, the strategy fails. The dynamic has shifted from a hierarchy to a hostage situation. The member states now hold the keys to the Commission's credibility. They hold the physical levers of the entire operation. The institution appears frozen. It is caught between its rigid, legalistic instincts and the volatile, violent reality of hard power politics. Brussels is staring at a map that no longer obeys its commands. The rebellion has paralyzed the system, and the silence from the Commission is the sound of an authority realizing it has lost control. The power has moved, and it is not moving back. We are witnessing the absolute end of the top-down era of European integration. The rebellion over the Ukraine strategy is not a temporary glitch. It will not be smoothed over with a few polite committees or a handful of subsidies. It is a systemic turning point. The genie of unilateral action is out of the bottle, and it cannot be put back. This crisis has normalized a dangerous idea within the bloc, that national interest trumps collective obligation. The precedent has been set in stone. When the stakes are high enough, the rules no longer apply. Looking forward, this signals the arrival of a more fragmented, transactional Europe. The idealistic vision of an ever closer union is being replaced by the cold reality of conditional cooperation. Brussels will no longer be able to assume automatic alignment on major geopolitical files. The era of blind faith is over. Every future strategy will have to be negotiated piece by piece. Member states will demand concrete, written guarantees for their own populations before signing on to collective goals. The days of the blank check for EU foreign policy are gone. The implications for the Commission are severe. To survive this cataclysmic loss of authority, the EU leadership faces a brutal choice. They must either fundamentally rethink their approach, shifting from dictation to genuine partnership, or they will watch their influence crumble further. If they continue to pretend that this defiance is merely a communication error rather than a structural rejection of their methods, the cracks will widen. The rebellion has revealed the truth that the establishment tried to hide. The Union is not a monolith. It is a collection of sovereign states who have just remembered their own power. The question is no longer whether Brussels can discipline these nations. The question is whether Brussels can adapt fast enough to a reality where it is no longer the undisputed master of the continent.